I am Gail Kislevitz, and today I will be speaking with Frank Handelman for the Theodore Corbett Institute for Running History Research. Frank was born in April 1945 in Cleveland, Ohio, and now lives in Sharon, Connecticut. He has three brothers and a sister. He attended the University.
Also, Gail, I have to correct. I'm basically primarily in Brooklyn, New York, with a second home in Sharon, Connecticut. I'm sorry to edit your thing.
Okay, so we'll just keep that going. He attended the University of Pittsburgh and graduated in 1967, then attended the University of Chicago, where he received his master's in social work, and then on to New York University for his law degree. Frank is a criminal defense lawyer, a professor at Fordham University, and has been a coach of running for many, many years. Most recently, he is the head coach of cross country and track for the Litchfield, Connecticut County High Schools. He has run 15 marathons, including 5 Bostons and 3 New York marathons. He is a member and past president of the Central Park Track Club and a former marathon coach for New York Roadrunners charity team, Team for Kids. He was also a member of the Pioneer Club from 1969 for 3 years, which we will hear more about. Frank competed for 2 historic integrated teams during the Jim Crow era of segregation, the University of Chicago Track Club and Ten Hayden, and the New York Pioneer Club with Joe Yancey and Ed Levy. So Frank, thanks for speaking with me today, and we will start with the first question. The first question being, when and how did you start running? Or I guess when and why did you start running?
That's a great question because I've thought about that a lot. I didn't begin into my 11th grade junior year in high school in Cleveland, Ohio. I went to a very large public school with a lot of sports teams, and I basically played baseball before that. I tried a little basketball, and I played some tennis. Baseball was my primary interest, but to be quite blunt, I was not very good at it. My basic skills were I had a lot of speed and a good throwing arm, but not much else. And I just decided, starting in 11th grade, that I would give a shot at cross country, which I had never thought about before. And when I joined the team, it was all boys in those days. Unfortunately, this is the '60s. And I joined the team in my fall of my junior year. There was a new coach who had just started, and he decided not to cut anybody. Even those days, they used to cut runners. So he let anybody run. And for about a month and a half, maybe a month, I was sort of a scrub in the back of the pack. And then as I started to get in shape, I developed. And I found that I really enjoyed it. And I started to move up. And by the end of the cross-country season, I guess I was second man on the team, if I remember. And then it went from there. And in track my junior year, I didn't do fantastically, but I ran pretty well. I remember my first mile I ever raced was an indoor mile in Cleveland at somebody's in a gym. We used to run these races on gym floors. And I ran about 4:55, and I threw myself on the ground sobbing, and the coach walked over and said, "No one's impressed."
Oh, wow. That's
I
another
didn't do that anymore.
beginning.
But it got better from there. In my senior year in cross country, I was one of the better runners in Cleveland and the state. I won several individual invitational kind of races. I won most of our dual meets, and I went to the state championships. Where I only placed 17th. I was not happy, but that was my first big time race. That was in Columbus, Ohio. And then my senior year in track, I sort of developed pretty well. I ran the mile and a half mile, basically. And in those days, it was all really rocky cinder tracks. And Ohio didn't have very fast times compared to the West Coast. But I ran 4:31 and 1:59 for the mile and the half mile. The half mile in those days, not the 800 meters. And I was competitive enough in some big meets that I got some scholarship offers. So I ended up running in college.
So do you attribute starting from a not so great beginner And then you went on to become a really good fast runner, nationally acclaimed. Was it your own drive? Was it the coaching? What was the turnaround?
I'd like to say it was the coaching, but that would be false because the coach was he had been a football coach. We later became friends in life, and he's long since deceased. But when I was 17 and started running, or 16, he was only about 28 and very immature, and didn't know what he was doing. So, for example, in my senior year, by the time I had become one of the better runners, between my junior and senior year, he threw me off the team 4 times because I didn't race up to his standards. And the team had to vote me back on every time. That was
Oh,
his
that's
level
funny.
of maturity and understanding.
Yeah.
Basically, I was pretty driven. Once I got to that level of success, and once I saw that I could do it, I just went for it. Interestingly, I was very involved in other stuff in high school. Again, it was a huge public high school, Cleveland Heights High School. I had about 3,000 kids in 10th, 11th, and 12th grade. There was no ninth grade in high school then. That was junior high. And I was in the orchestra playing French horn. And I was the editorial editor of the high school paper, in line to become editor in chief my senior year. And I gave both those up my senior year to focus on track and cross country.
Okay.
Which to me was a wise choice, but I'm not sure anymore why I did it.
Well, I'm glad you did. So did you keep scrapbooks or racing diaries or photos from any of your past running years?
Yeah, quite a lot. Not from high school. And I actually do have I have training diaries, which basically were my daytimer kind of books. I have a couple of examples here because there's one race I'll refer to later. Little daytimers like this, where I keep my appointments. This when I was in law school, when I was a social worker before I went to law school, and I also put my training in there. So this book is a combination of all my appointments and my contacts and my training every day. So I started keeping those, and there's all kinds of variety of those books, but I kept them pretty regularly, probably until I would say my late 50s.
That's good. That's a great history of your running.
Got tons of those, tons of those.
So since your high school coach was not that great, what coaches did influence your training and your racing?
Well, the most important coach I ever had, I'm sure, was Ted Hayden. He was the Hall of Fame track and field coach at the U of Chicago. He was the U of Chicago undergraduate coach and had been a social worker, had been, I think, a javelin thrower. But he became the coach of the high college team, and then he started in the late 50s, early 60s, the Chicago Track Club, UC, University of Chicago Track Club, which in those days was one of the major national teams. There were teams like the New York Athletic Club, the Chicago Track Club. There weren't too many others that were really hugely prominent. And he had on that team, we trained with the undergraduates. There was no distinction. At the University of Chicago facility, there was no charge. You just showed up. And he had on that team basically anybody who wanted to run. People who, I was in graduate school there, so I did that. People who were, workers in the city of Chicago, blue collar workers, professionals, academics. And, the team was never huge. Maybe it was 25 or 30 people besides the undergraduates. But he was a phenomenal coach and had a great philosophy that running was only part of your life. And he would do really short and intense workouts. I unfortunately didn't get full benefit of my 2 years there because in those 2 years, which was 1967 to 69, I was primarily involved in civil rights and anti-Vietnam War organizing work, to be blunt. I was in social work school and I was training with the team. And I would go to practice most days, but I really wasn't into it. So I ran slower there than I ran in college.
Okay.
To
Is
his
there,
frustration, because those are the years you should get faster.
yeah. Is there something that you took away from Ted's coaching that you implemented in your own coaching later on?
absolutely. Two things. One, and I really believe I've always done this. Workouts should be manageable in terms of time because people have lives besides the workouts. So Ted's workouts would be on a Monday, you'd show up, you warm up, and maybe do 4 times 200 in the flat out. Pretty close to flat out. In those days, I might do them in practice in like 25, something like that. And then jog down, and that'd be the workout. Or else it would be a 3/4 mile time trial. It would be a warm up, a time trial, with no pressure, with spikes on, and go home. But the second part of that was he absolutely knew that people had other aspects of their lives that were just as important. So he tolerated me and my politics. He's frustrated because he thought I could run much faster than I ran in college. And I probably could have because the team was full of great half milers. But he tolerated me because he saw what else I was doing was important. So that's my philosophy in coaching. Make workouts manageable and make them so people can have their lives.
Yeah, that's great. And a lot of coaches did not do that, especially in college. So when you were in the prime of your competing, whether it was on the track or the marathon, what did a typical training week look like?
Well, I would say for 7 years, I ran marathons, and I probably never should have after the first couple because I was not adept at that distance. I ran 2:35, my best time, 3 times in 3 years, twice in Boston, once in Yonkers. And I just wasn't comfortable at that pace, which is just like 5:50 something pace. But my training for those days was basically about 6 or 7 days a week, about 70 miles a week, mostly easy, long distance running. When I started becoming a marathoner, I transitioned from Pioneer Club to the new Central Park Track Club in 72 to 73. I was running maybe 70 a week while other people were running 120, 130 miles a week. It was massive mileage in those days. And they were running faster marathons, but I wanted to run shorter stuff. So I would do a lot of easy runs, and I would do most of my easy training like at the Central Park Reservoir. I lived on the Upper West Side of New York, or on the park roads, at maybe 8 minutes, 8:30 pace. And then everybody else was training much faster than me. But I knew what I was doing because I had run in college, so I would beat them in races.
Mm-hmm.
The training was a lot of easy running, and about twice a week, if I didn't have a race, I would do a very intense, maybe once a week or twice a week, I would do a very intense pace run. The rest of it was easy running.
All right, since you mentioned the Pioneer Club, let's just jump into that now. You joined the Pioneer Club in 69?
Yes, I graduated Chicago in the spring of 1969 with my master's and moved to New York and took a job with a group called the New York City Mission Society, which is a Presbyterian social work oriented church group. And I worked for them, basically downtown and then in the Bronx for about 2.5 years to 3 years before I went to law school. But when I was leaving Chicago, Ted Hayden said, check out the New York Pioneer Club with Joe Yancey and Ed Levy. I'm sure they'd love to have you on their 2-mile relay. So as soon as I got to New York, I contacted them and they basically said, well, we don't really have half milers, sprinters.
Yeah.
So I said, okay, I joined them anyhow. And besides running cross country and distance for them eventually, my first year and a half or two with them, I focused on the 400, the 440 in those days, the 400 meters, where I was capable, but not excellent. I was capable. My best time was about 49 point.
So, let me ask you, do you remember who was in the club at that time?
We had an unbelievable team and roster of great athletes. The most important were several Olympians, Vince Matthews, who went on to win the gold medal in the 400 in the 72 Olympics, I believe in Berlin. A guy named Alfred Daly from Jamaica. These are all guys who ran like 46 in those days, 45, 46 or better for the 400 or the quarter. Two New Yorkers who I remember very well, Glenn Shane, who's still a friend and is still around, and he's involved now with Van Cortlandt Track Club. And he was a year or two older than me, but he was a real natural, great sprinter. A guy named Ed Smalls, who became the track and field director at the Armory up at 168th Street. It was not anymore, but it used to be. There was a huge group, and we trained late at night, usually about 9 or 10 o'clock at night, twice a week.
And where would you meet? Would you meet at McComb's?
No, we trained indoors at an armory at 142nd Street and Fifth Avenue along the East River. I think it was the something Engineers Armory. And during the day, it was a wood floor like a gym. During the day, they had tennis there all day. And in the evening, they took off the tennis stuff and they had a painted line, and we ran our workouts there. And that was our training facility. We never raced there. And the workouts would either be 8 or 9 o'clock at night, sometimes 10 o'clock at night.
Oh my God, after putting in a full day of work.
It was fantastic. I loved it. Again, I was new to New York. This is all an adventure to me. The best story about that was my first year with them, qualifying for the Milrose Games, the New York Athletic Club games in those days, the Olympic Invitational, Knights of Columbus meets. We had time trials, and I'll never forget this. I have it in my training book. 56 guys tried out for the mile relay for those games, and there was two teams. There was the A team and the B team. The A team ran in the open races. The B team ran in what they used to call the club and college handicap relays, where the leadoff runner might get a 10-yard lead based on your time, or we'd be at scratch starting from the start. And I came in 6th out of 56.
That's excellent. That's a good
I don't
time.
know what I ran anymore. It was probably like 51, something like that, because it was a slow track. But I made the team, so that season I ran, indoors for the Pioneers.
Wow, it sounds like a great history with them.
And we would travel other places. We went to Albany a few times. We'd go to other places, but mostly we'd run in the Armory at 168th Street, or we'd run in the Madison Square Garden.
And then you left to join Central Park Track Club.
Yeah, what happened was, and I've always still felt both mixed feelings about this. I love Central Park Track Club, but when I decided to become a long distance runner, I started training for long distance in about 70 to 71. I had never done the road race in my life. I had never done anything longer than like 2 miles in high school cross country, or 4 or 5 miles in college cross country. I started training by myself and looked around and realized the Pioneer Club was a great team, but didn't have a lot of long distance running. They had Ted Corbett, and I'll talk about him, and Al Williams, a great friend, and they were important. But I was living and training right by the reservoir in Central Park, and became good friends with a guy named David Blackstone, who has passed away quite a while ago, but he was the original #1 founder of Central Park Track Club. And somewhere in the middle of, I don't know, late 72, when the club started, I decided to leave the Pioneers and join Central Park Track Club.
Okay. So let me just skip around here. Another question is, do you have any memories or good stories about running in McComb's Dam Park, Van Cortlandt, Central Park, Yonkers Marathon, anything like that?
I had fantastic memories of McComb's Dam Park and Van Cortlandt, of course. McComb's Dam Park, before they had the new Yankee Stadium, was across the street from the old Yankee Stadium. And there was a little city building we called the clubhouse. It was basically the size of a garage, but it was a little concrete building, and it had like meeting rooms and locker rooms, and all the races on the road runners that I ran for those first 2 or 3 years started there. And the race course was up and down Sedgwick Avenue, which is about 2 or 3 miles up and back. I think maybe a 4-mile round trip. We'd run from Yankee Stadium up Sedgwick Avenue on the street or the sidewalk. They never stopped traffic.
With all the cars coming.
Up to paralleling the Major Deegan, but on Sedgwick, up to what was then NYU in the Heights before it became Bronx Community College. And then you'd make a U-turn and go back the other way. So all the races started and finished there. There was also a famous race which continued in Central Park till many years, many years. I think they stopped it, called the Bob Preston Memorial, which is 5 miles, which I ran a bunch of times in Central Park. But in those days, it was 11 laps around the old Yankee Stadium. And they swore it was exactly 5 miles. And I never believed it, but who cared? So I
Sure.
ran that a couple times, and you had to count your own laps. You had to be on the honor system. There was nobody, maybe 30 or 40 or 50 runners, but nobody was going to keep track of who was where. So you had to keep track of your own 11 laps and stop when you stopped.
Mm-hmm.
So
Do you
that
remember
was,
who were you running with those days? Was it Murky
uh,
and that whole gang?
well, yeah, Gary Murky and I always ran against each other. I always would beat him at shorter stuff, and he would beat me solidly in the marathons. You know, I would 5K or 5,000 or 4 miles. I would be substantially ahead of Gary, but he would always kill me in the marathons. So
Mm-hmm.
Gary Murky was a major person. Norb Sander, of course, was always way up front. Tom Fleming came along a couple years later and dominated many things. He was a great runner who came second. I'm sure you know him well, Gail.
Yes,
Came
right,
second in Boston Marathon twice.
right.
He,
He's a Jersey guy.
he was the star runner in our world in those days. A guy named Jimmy McDonough, who ran from Melrose, and he was about a 2:28 marathoner. He was about 5'4", and he looked like he couldn't run very fast, but he was indomitable. And I remember being in races with Jimmy where you could hear his footpats pit pat behind you, and you knew you were doomed. Come by. Um, Vince Chiappetta, who became president of the Roadrunners before Fred LeBeau, he was a top runner in those days. Let's see, Joe Burns. These are mostly Milrose guys.
Mm-hmm.
But I never joined Milrose for some reason because I joined Central Park. Joe Burns, who was about maybe 8 or 9 years older than me. So if I was in my 20s, he was in his 30s. He was a really great guy and a great influence on me and a runner. He used to run his races in hush puppies.
You
Uh,
kidding? He didn't have running shoes? Well, I guess the running shoes weren't around then.
who knows? Because they were soft shoes. And one year I got bad blisters and I was heading up to the Boston Marathon and my feet were killing me. He said, run in hush puppies. So I did. Um, he was
That's
a
funny.
major person. And Ted Corbett, of course.
Good. Did you ever run the Cherry Tree Marathon?
No, I ran my first marathon, which is the only one I ever dropped out of, was 1971 in what was called the Earth Day Marathon, which was the successor of Cherry Tree. So Cherry Tree was in the Bronx. Earth Day, they moved to Central Park, and it was 5 laps around the park plus a mile at the beginning to make a marathon. 5 laps of the 5-mile loop, the lower loop.
Mm-hmm.
I had run a 20-mile race a week or two before. I figured I could run about 2:46 or something for the marathon. And I managed that pace for 16 or 17 miles, and I totally cracked. I,
You're
I
not
quit.
the only one who dropped out of their first marathon. Many runners have done that.
Yeah, I did. So the next month was my first Boston. And I decided I'm just going to run this slow and easy and not have any problems. And I think I did 3:13 and I finished happily.
Good,
So
good. So would you consider the McCombs course tougher to run than running in Central Park?
I think it was because there was all these U-turns. And also you were not running in any kind of controlled setting. We'd run on basically on the sidewalk. They didn't want us on the street because cars were going by, and cars would often park in the parking lane. So if I remember correctly, most of the racing was either on a combination of the street and sidewalk, but they never closed the roads. There was no
Mhm.
such thing as closing roads. And again, it was enjoyable because I was so new at it, I didn't know what I was doing. And I was not winning anything. I was, I would probably, I can look at my book and see that my first year of those distance runs, I was coming in 6th or 7th or 8th in fields of like 40 or 45 people. And So I never felt any particular pressure to be up in the beginning, the front.
Yeah. Um,
Um,
so another question which you've already answered is who were your favorite racing rivals? And it's probably all those guys you just mentioned, Chiappetta, Murky, McDonough, all of them. So
the New York Athletic Club was a serious competitor. They were the New York AC in those days was a team that basically brought in runners from around the country who were top notch athletes. They had a budget for it, and they flew them in for things like the Metropolitan Cross Country Championship in Van Cortlandt every year, which in those days was 6 miles, became 10K, I guess. And I had two or three really good friends in there. A guy named Marcel Philippe, who had been an 800 a half miler for France, who ran the Olympics twice. He had run it for them. He's from New York, but he's French. And he's still a friend. He became a district attorney. Ed Bowes, who was he died last year, a couple years ago. He was the very famous coach at Bishop Laughlin High School in Brooklyn, a boys' high school. And Ed Bowes and I had a great rivalry. So people like that. And so the New York Athletic Club was a major force. One year, when I was, I don't know, about my third or fourth year in, when I was getting better, I came in 10th in the Metropolitan Cross Country meet in Van Cortlandt. And the first 9 were from the New York Athletic Club.
oh my gosh.
And the only one who lived in New York was myself, Philippe. The other 8 all had been imported from one place or another. So
Yeah, and some of the clubs that you were running for, they didn't do that. They didn't import runners.
right.
So yeah, you were running against people not from the New York area. Did you ever run in the late, well, I guess it would have had to be the 70s when, it passed Title IX. Did you ever run against women like Nina Cusick or people like that in races? Women runners
Absolutely.
back then?
Um, One of the great things about the Sedgwick Avenue course starting at McCombs Dam in that little building was Nina was the first and regular runner there. And she was always a very good athlete because we know that. And she would run all these races with a huge smile. And because the way the races went were out and back, you'd pass everybody a number of times. And she always had this big smile, and she was always friendly and very forthcoming. The other thing about it was the McCombs Dam building had a little shower room. And so we would go in there, change clothes for the meet, and then take showers. And we all had to get out of the shower so Nina could get in the shower. I remember that
And
very well.
she was the only female running back then in the McCombs area?
One year I ran, um, after I got a little better at the marathon, I was running under 3 hours fairly easily. One year, about 6 of us, and I believe it was maybe 1973, I'll have to look it up, ran the Earth Day Marathon together, not in New York City, but Earth Day was the race in the spring. That's the successor to Cherry Blossom.
Uh-huh.
And we decided there were 2 or 3 people who hadn't broken 3 hours. A guy named Bill Endek, who's a very wonderful guy who's still active as a sprinter in New Jersey. He's a coach there. So I wrote down on my wrist all the splits we would need for each lap with ink for the 3-hour marathon. And Nina Cusick and I and Bill Endek and Paul Fetcher, who was an old friend, and 1 or 2 others all ran that race all the way together. And we all ran 2:57, 2:58. Bill Endek got his 2:59. So that was tremendous fun. There was no
Yeah,
pressure
that's
because
a great memory.
I was a little faster in those days. I just did it to be with people.
That's a good memory. Did you ever race against the Geisler children, Barry Jr. and Eric? Are those names familiar?
So I knew Barry Geisler pretty well, but not as kids. I'm sure I did, but I wasn't really aware of them.
Okay. Um, and let's see, memories of these racing formats, a handicap road race, postal track races, two-man
Yeah.
10 relays. Did you ever do any of those?
Well, handicap races, I ran a bunch of those. They were basically held in Van Cortlandt Park. And the thing to know, I can tell you that even though the New York City Marathon started in 71, the road running scene did not move to Central Park until December of 72. And I'll tell you about that in a minute. But all of our races were in Van Cortlandt Park. And handicap would be, it might be like a 5 mile cross country race in Van Cortlandt, and they would start you based on your handicap time. So you would start 30 seconds or 40 seconds ahead, or start scratch, which means you were a faster person and you'd have to wait. In those days, nobody was very slow. So it's not like anybody had like a 5 minute handicap. It was always within a couple of minutes. So I ran a few of those, and I remember once or twice I won one of those, but I wasn't the fastest athlete. And I think I won one based on my performance, my finish time, but the overall winner was probably maybe someone like Howie Ryan, who ran for New York Athletic Club in those days. Because I may have started 30 seconds ahead of him, but he ran 20 seconds faster, but I would still be so-called the winner. That's how so what they did was they didn't take seconds off your time. They started you at different points.
Right, right. Okay.
But
Um,
the 1 hour run against the track, I did a few times. Most notably, I remember going to CW Post in Long Island, and this is the first time I ever had much knowledge about Fred LeBeau. If I'm jumping around here,
that's okay. Go ahead.
Vince Chiappetta and I were friends. He was the head road. He was president of Roadrunners then, and he was a professor of mathematics at NYU, and I was then at NYU Law School, I guess. So we would see each other, and one year to go to this race at CW Post, it was probably about 71. Vince, I drove and I picked up Vince and Fred LeBeau, who I didn't really know. And Fred sat in the back seat, and we went out to this race, and there was maybe, I don't know, 30 runners. And there that you had to have someone to keep track of where you were in terms of time. And you would run as far as you could for an hour. And everybody would have to have someone to keep track of how many laps. And I did, I don't know, 10 and a half miles or something. I didn't win, but I was near the front. And Fred was just somebody we all kept lapping. He was, I remember that.
Uh, all right. So there's a lot of clubs listed here. I'm not going to name all of them, but is there a club, because you have the list, is there a club that stands out as a really strong club that you raced against?
Yeah, I would say that Milrose was the most important rival we had. I mean, the two major teams, I know all these teams. And I can remember some of the people. I didn't know Gallic American very well, but every other team on your list, St. Anthony Boys Club, um, Staten Island Athletic Club became, I think, the North Shore Track Club. That was Arthur Hall's team. United AA, but the major teams before Central Park got successful, our club, were Milrose and New York Athletic Club. Milrose was mostly guys, I would say, from the Bronx. Probably not accurate, but that's how I remember it.
Mm-hmm.
They had a phenomenal team. They had John Garlop, who died this year, who was always out in front in those McCombs Dam races. He won a bunch of those. Vince Chiappetta, Norb Sander, Gary Murky, they were always dominant. And the New York AC brought in these top guys. So those are the clubs I remember competing against most. The Pioneer Club still continued to have some distance running, but not, I'm sad to say, it's the distance running aspect of the club faded away somewhat after, by the mid 70s.
Right.
Long Island Striders, I don't remember, but it became the Long Island Athletic Club later on. Paul Fetcher was sort of the major domo of that one. Another team you don't have on here was Warren Street, called the Warren Street Social and Athletic Club. And those were people who left Central Park Track Club. I think they wanted to have more fun. We were a serious team, to be honest. And that was Hugh Sweeney, who was one of my biggest rivals, Alan Silber, a good friend, Paul Fetcher, and a bunch of other people, including a very good women's team, became the Warren Street. And they were very, very strong and good in the, I guess it would say the mid to late 70s to early 80s. And
Mm-hmm.
an excellent coach named Tracy Sundlin, who was still a friend, but he moved out to California years ago. So Warren Street was a big factor. Even though they were in Jersey, they were part of the New York City racing scene.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right, so moving on to the publications, and there's a lot of them here. You probably are familiar with all of them. did you subscribe to any particular publication?
Yeah, well, I always subscribe to Track and Field News. In fact, I still do. On and off over the years I have, but I have again the last couple of years. Um, Long distance log, I joined as soon as I became a more distance oriented runner, about 71, and had all those copies until they folded about 1975 or 76. Distance running news became Runner's World. And in the early years, I liked that. And then I stopped reading it, to be blunt, because to me, Runner's World is just a magazine that runs the same articles every few months. I think of interest for me. There was a magazine called Running Times out of Washington,
Oh, Riding Times is a good one.
really excellent. And of course, the New York Road Runners Club newsletter, which became their magazine, which
Hmm.
ran until the internet age, knocked everything out of print. And I had several massive cartons of all these journals, and I finally shipped them all to Gary Corbett. So
Oh, okay, good.
that's
Good.
my library.
Yeah, he's trying to preserve everything. So now let's move on to the governing bodies of sports, the AAU, RRCA, NYRR. Do you have any thoughts, or, oh, what's the word I'm looking for? What would you like? The Amateur Athletic Union usually is the one that everyone sort of jumps all over. Road Runners Club, NYRR, as you know, it's a great, great body of runners. And so is the RRCA. So do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, first I had very little association with the Road Runners Club of America because by the time I became a road runner, I was living in New York, and that was the New York Road Runners, um, which became the NYRR, of course. The Amateur Athletic Union, AAU, ran everything until I guess somewhere in the late 70s it became what's called the Athletics Congress, and that became USA Track and Field. But the AAU was impossible. When I moved from Chicago to New York, and I was going to move from Chicago Track Club to the Pioneer Club, I had to sit out for 3 months, I think it was. I went downtown, had a meeting, I won't name names, with their officials down on Park Row. They were down by City Hall on Park Row in those days. And I had, I had a letter from Ted Hayden saying that I was excused from the Pioneer Club. I mean, Chicago Track Club. A letter from Joe Yancey, I guess it was, that I could join the Pioneers. I had to sit out for 3 months because I was changing teams. It was a totally ridiculous, arbitrary rule. And they ran everything, but also they ran all the championships. For example, my only long distance race I ever won, real long distance race, was the Metropolitan 30-kilometer in Central Park in 1974, where I came in first. And that was called the Mid AAU Championship. That's how those were the names of all those races. The Road Runners Club, of course, in New York, you know all about.
Right.
When I joined in 1969, I think the roster was about 150 people. I have somewhere one of those original rosters, with my name on it, with a lot of the people I've named here before. And many of them, most of us knew each other, but get to know each other. But that was the organization. And when I joined them, I don't believe they had any location at all. Then for a while, they were in the West Side Y at 63rd Street. They had a little office they rented in the West Side Y. And then that was their headquarters. Ultimately, of course, they got much bigger. They moved into the townhouse on East 89th Street,
Hmm.
moved across town. So let's put it this way, I was always a competitive athlete within the New York Road Runners Club. I never sought any particular role. I never wanted to run for the board or be involved in any official capacity, or ultimately, ironically, I ended up coaching for them, as you
Yeah,
know.
I know. I know. Those were fun years. So do you have any really interesting, fun stories of runners that you experienced or heard from the past that you'd like to share?
I'll just tell you one really great story that may not be about any particular runner. In the days when all the races were in Van Cortlandt Park, I remember going there on a very rainy, misty day where there may be a typical field of 50 or 60 people. And I think it was an 8 mile race. And what happened was those races in those days would start on the flat or else by the Van Cortlandt Stadium track and do a little run on the paved path there and then go up a long flight of stairs up through a road that crossed over the golf course, through Yonkers, through the backyards of Yonkers, onto Central Avenue, into the back hills. And the one year I remember, and we ran races there. My first road race ever, there was a 30-kilometer in that course, which I loved. I remember Ted Corbett. But one time there, it was the most fun ever, was whoever was leading the race, I was in 7th or 8th place in the pack. Whoever was leading the race went up those stairs and made a wrong turn.
Yeah.
We all followed that person for about half a mile, and then someone yelled, "Hey, this is wrong." We all turned around. Then we came back and tried to find the course. And by the end of the day, runners were coming into the finish line of the Van Cortlandt Park Flats from 3 or 4 different directions. Nobody had any clue where the hell they had been, what distance they had run. They scrapped all the finish times. They scrapped all the awards. And we all just hung out and had the greatest time ever and went across the street to one of those bars on Broadway and had beer and breakfast together.
That's a
So
very funny
that's
story.
one of my absolute favorite memories of running in New York.
That's great.
It was a totally different world, Gail.
Yeah, I know. Well, the other thing I think of a lot, and you were running in the 60s and beyond, is that back then there were no super shoes, there were no goos, there was none of the stuff that runners have today.
Nothing.
And I keep thinking, would it have made a difference in your times and your running if you did or not?
Yeah, but there's no point in going into that. I used to think, too bad I ran, my best 800-meter time was 1:53, which is respectable, but not anywhere near making an Olympic team. As you know, in those days, I would have had to run about 1:47, 1:46 or something. But we ran those races in these pretty primitive spikes, often the kind of spikes that you couldn't even screw when they were permanent spikes made by Adidas, and on dirt and cinder tracks. So I used to spend a lot of time thinking about, boy, now, that was the early 1960s. This is ridiculous 60 years ago. Ironically, thinking about this stuff, Gail, I said this to someone recently, is my track club is, Central Park Track Club is now a huge phenomenon with many, many hundreds of people and tremendous amount of complete top level runners.
And great sponsorship.
But, yeah, for me to talk to those people who barely know me anymore about what I ran in the 1960s and 70s would be like someone then telling me about what they accomplished in 1920,
Yeah,
right?
true.
So
True.
the hell with it. I mean, it just doesn't seem to make any sense. So yes, sure, I with the super shoes, what I run, my marathoning wasn't great anyhow. It wasn't my sport. The 2:35, I was just, in those days, that wasn't bad, but I was never anywhere near anything top notch.
Mhm.
Maybe I would have run 8 minutes faster in these shoes, but who cares? But in track, I look now at the astonishing amount of people who are running 4 minutes in high school in track.
Yeah,
And
that's
it's
a
just,
huge difference.
in my day, if you ran 4:20 in high school, you were one of the best in the country.
Yeah.
It's the tracks are better, but the shoes are unbelievable. Everything else adds up, I'm sure, nutrition and training, but the equipment and the tracks make a huge difference.
It does, but as historians, which is what this is all about, I think it's important for the young runners coming up today to realize that we didn't have any of that. I mean, there wasn't even water on courses, and
That's right.
I do think that it's important to keep history.
My 1:53 might have been a 1:49, 1:48 point with all the new improvements, but even then, by the time I would run that, people were still running 7 or 8 seconds faster. So, that's a
True.
big difference.
True. All right, so we did right there, we just kind of covered how the sport has evolved and how big it has become. Um,
Well, one other comment. I am a pretty good reader of track and field news, and I've been frustrated for years because they don't do feature stories. They basically write, about meets. But I've been waiting for years for them to do a major feature on the shoes and how they're affecting the events, from the marathon all the way down to the mile and the half mile. I mean, the times are unbelievable. They're hard to account for.
Mhm.
But no, I guess they figure this is legitimate. Everybody is entitled to wear the same shoes, and they do.
Yeah.
But
There are
it's a
publications
difference.
that do write a lot about the shoes because they are making a huge difference, but you have to be one of those sponsored elite runners to afford $500, $600 for those shoes, which are sometimes made just for that person. So
Right.
yeah, it's not an equal running field anymore.
It's true. All true.
So did you know Fred Lebo? Do you have any memories or
I
stories
knew
about
Fred.
Fred?
I knew Fred extremely well. He, of course, if you look at the original picture from the Central Park Track Club, there were about 10 of us in 1972 with Dave Blackstone, the founder, and his wife, Lynn, my closest friend who I met the first days of law school, Jack Brennan. He and I went to NYU together. And we became running buddies for the next 30 years until he died at age 52. He was a 220 marathoner, top-notch long distance runner. Kathy Switzer was in that group. Fred LeBeau was in the group. So I knew him very well then. I had a lot to do with him. We were pretty good friends and colleagues in that world for
Hmm.
quite a long time.
Good.
I
All
would, I
right.
would say this. Fred, I wrote an article for the Central Park Track Club newsletter back when that existed, when Fred died. And it was all about Fred. And it started out with Fred always wore those little hats.
Yes, he did.
But my basic theme was that basically Fred's major contribution was getting masses to run races. And to me, Fred was an impresario. That's what he was. He might have been an impresario about the music industry, about theater, about any kind of business, but he chose running. And his skill was getting people to participate. And I'll always give him credit for that. I mean, one year I took to meet with Fred, you had to run. So one year, as a lawyer, I represented another runner I know well, who I won't name, who had been suspended for the road runners from races because he ran in a race pushing a baby stroller. And you weren't allowed to do that ever. In those days, people started to do that stuff. So I wanted to get his suspension lifted. So I had to do a 6-mile run with Fred around Central Park so we could discuss the whole case.
And what
So
happened? What was the outcome?
he got reinstated. I think they just reprimanded him and he got reinstated. He was a good runner. I won't name him. But I remember in that run, I had been winning races in those days, but I hadn't won a huge thing yet. And Fred said to me, Frank, when are you gonna run a really big win a really big race? And I said, Fred, you've got to put on a really big race at my distance.
Ah,
It's not going to be 20 miles or the marathon. So
okay. Yeah, he was quite a character. So the next question is, what is the toughest marathon course you competed on? And I think we've kind of covered that, but go ahead. What do you think it was?
probably the original Yonkers Marathon course. I ran Yonkers a few times. One year was not quite as tough. In 1974, it was the National Marathon AAU Championship at Yonkers, and they started and finished at Yonkers Raceway. And it was a series of laps around the raceway and then the streets. It was hilly and tough. And I remember that race well because Jack Brennan, who I mentioned, he and I graduated law school that day. And we were, both running well those days, but not great. And we ran the race together. And in the middle, I was really tired. He waited for me at the end. He was tired, and I helped him. And we held hands at the end and ran 2:35. It came in about 30th. And then went down to law school to NYU, to Washington Square, and graduated law school the same day. That was fun.
Oh, wow. An
Actually, the
accomplishing
original
day.
course, the
Um,
original famous Yonkers course was excruciating, and I ran that
yes.
one time, I think in 1977, my last year of marathoning. and it was, a bunch of flattened downhill, but then it was basically uphill for about 16 to 21 miles.
Mm.
That was the hardest course I ever ran.
It was a tough one, and it used to be an Olympic qualifier. You had to run Yonkers.
Yonkers was a hugely important major race. Then they stopped it for a while. Now it's back, but I don't think it's the same course.
Yeah, I remember I never ran it, but I was covering it for a magazine, and the race director drove me around the course, and that was enough for me to say, not doing that.
Right.
Um, so we did talk a little bit about the Roadrunners Club of America, which you were not that terribly involved with, but they had a certificate program. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, 1 year. I think what you had to do was, I don't remember even signing up for this. That certificate program ended probably in the early 70s because I looked at my old papers after I saw your notes. And the only one I have is like a second class certificate because I had run 3 or 4 races in fast enough times to get that, not even first class. Um, and I've got a piece of paper, I don't know, signed by Vince Chiappetta, I suppose. It says that, but they
Okay.
stopped doing that.
All right.
But by the time I was running much faster, I got about 75, 74 to 75, up to about 80 or 81 is when I had my most successful road racing life. And they didn't have that anymore then.
Okay. Now on the sheet of the printout that Gary sent to all of us, there is I guess a panel discussion that you were on about the pioneer history. It's a testimonial. I think we're just going to link it when we post this, but tell us more about Ted Corbett.
Well, obviously, Ted was very important to all of us. And I remember very well when I lived 47 years in the Upper West Side, now in Brooklyn. But I lived right by Central Park West, usually between the 70s or 80s. And I would see Ted running to work in the morning from the Bronx down Central Park, not in the park, but on the road, the sidewalk, which I used to work out on myself at night, especially when the park road was covered with snow. And I would see Ted going back and forth. He ran back and forth to work. And he was just, an unbelievable inspiration. My first road distance race ever was a 30-kilometer, when I was with Pioneers, of course, um, in Van Cortlandt Park, which had that crazy course I described, where, the back hills was Van Cortlandt, up a long flight of stairs, through backyards, Central Avenue in Yonkers. And that was like 4.5 miles. So we'd have to run that 4 times to get a 30-kilometer race in 18 miles. And my first road race or distance race was that race. I guess it must have been 71. And I ran it with Ted. And he basically just didn't say much. At the beginning, he said, just stay with me, whatever. And we ran all the way together. And I finished one place ahead of him, maybe a couple of seconds. But again, I was about 26 and he was about 52. He was twice my age, right? So he was incredibly important in terms of doing things like measuring courses. When they set up the first 5-borough course, which became the famous New York Marathon we have now, Ted measured it. So he was really a key person in establishing that race. And he had some kind of bicycle system with a bicycle wheel that he used to calibrate the exact distances of these courses. I know he's famous for that, very famous for that. But Ted was just someone who didn't talk much. I remember one time, years later, there was a very excellent runner who I think he ran for the Bruce Track Club named Gunther Moses. Really a wonderful, fast guy who used to win a lot of races in the 60s, early 70s, maybe by the 70s he was older. And they had a birthday party for Gunther Moses in Red Hook, Brooklyn. Maybe 20 years ago when Gunther was turning about 70. He was much older than me. And I drove out there with my wife, Bonnie, and Ted was there. And it was in a bar. Red Hook in those days was really undeveloped. It was in the middle of winter in a bar with no heat. So we all wore our coats the whole time. And then I drove Ted home. And Bonnie and I drove Ted all the way up to the Bronx and drove him home. And he barely said a word. That was just who he was.
True.
Talk
True.
about somebody of incredible accomplishment, with absolutely no ego and no need to talk about it. That's Ted Corbett.
He never talked about himself, never shared anything. You had
Nothing.
to really drag it out of him. And then he would say it in such a soft voice. You had
Right.
to like
Also was a
lean in.
world-class physical therapist,
Hmm.
very, very famous at the Rusk Institute, which is part of NYU.
Did you ever meet his wife, Ruth?
No, I did not. And I did not know Gary in those days. I met Gary later on.
Okay. Now, your own wife, Bonnie, how did she put up with all your running and traveling around?
Pretty well. Bonnie had been a professional dancer. She went to Northwestern. She's from New York. She went to Northwestern and danced. I didn't know her then. When I was in Chicago, she was at Northwestern. We met each other in New York later. And she had been a professional dancer and then to her mid-20s and then moved into different work. Um, she retired several years ago from the Environmental Protection Agency, US EPA, as
Hmm.
a major public affairs director for the New York region, which is New York, New Jersey, and the Virgin Islands, US Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico. So a lot of travel there. She was very supportive, and one of the reasons was the way we met. We met on the way to the 1977 Boston Marathon, my last Boston, where I got a ride from my great friend Fritz Mueller. Fritz was, I'm sure you know of him, Gail, but he was
Yes.
world champion of the marathon, over 40. He ran 2:20 in Boston when he was about 41 to lower the record by about 7 or 8 minutes for his age. So he was one of the first of the world class, major masters runners. And he had joined Central Park Track Club a couple years after me. So he gave me a ride up there in his Volkswagen Beetle. His wife Marnie did not drive. So in those days, you had to get yourself to the start of a race. There was no buses, even Boston. Boston was only 2 or 3 thousand then. So Bonnie would go up to Boston because her brother lived there. She had family there to be the driver. To drive Fritz out to the start of the marathon. And Marnie didn't drive, his wife, she still doesn't drive, and come back. And one year they gave me a ride, and I got in the back seat of the car, and there was Bonnie, and that was it. So
Ah,
basically, I
that's a
fell
great
in love, and
story.
that started that whole thing. That was 1977. We
Hmm.
got married in 82.
Wow,
Okay.
that's a great
We were
story.
supportive because they were all runners. And she was a very good runner, but didn't really take to it. She ran by almost by default. She had no choice,
Hmm.
for a couple
True.
years.
Yeah.
She ran some races.
Um,
I will say that I'll give Bonnie full credit for basically saying to me, "You've had enough," when I started having all my different orthopedic surgeries, which I could talk about in a moment if you want. But I've had 2 hip replacements, 2 major foot reconstructions, a bunion surgery, a plantar fascia surgery, all these things, which
yeah.
basically ended me as a top runner in my 60s.
Yeah.
So
I remember you scooting around on that little foot thing when we were coaching together.
that's right. When I was coaching Team for Kids, I had a boot on my foot.
Yeah.
2 years because I had 2 surgeries. One failed, one succeeded on my
Mm.
right foot to
Yeah.
reconstruct and put my right foot's got titanium plates and screws in it.
Geez.
And I coached the team on a scooter.
I remember that. Did we talk about Al Williams and the influence he had on you?
Not yet, but I loved Al Williams. He died young. He died, I don't know how old he was, probably in his 40s. Al was a enormously likable and friendly guy on the Pioneer Club who was just about my height, but he was like twice my build. He had these unbelievable arms and shoulders and muscles and strength. And he was a very good runner. And my first couple of times I went to the Boston Marathon with Ted and Al Williams. And he was just, it's hard to describe it. I loved him so much. And he died so young, but died so many years ago. He just had a fantastic, good nature, deeply intellectual guy, very smart, very funny, somewhat quiet, but not as quiet as Ted Corbett. And I trained with him and I learned an enormous amount from Al Williams.
He sounds like a great guy.
Yeah. There was
So
another guy, by the way, who ran for, I'm not sure what team, St. Anthony Boys Club, named Bill Gordon, who also was in those days, there was a lot of really muscular guys. A lot of ex-boxers had become runners.
Mhm.
Had a couple guys, a guy named Joe Erskine, who had been a professional boxer. I don't know if Bill Gordon was, but again, he like Al was maybe my height, but was twice my build. I
Mm,
was a skinny kid. And Bill was just another phenomenal friend who died pretty young.
yeah. Did you ever know the Mackenzies, Chris Mackenzie and her husband?
Yes, I knew Gordon well, and the way I knew Gordon was, I always knew of Gordon. He was twice an Olympian. And I realized when I was a legal aid attorney in the Bronx in the 70s and started to focus, after I had stopped running marathons, I really started to focus on the 5,000 meters and the middle distance road races like that. In 1977, 78, I had a lot of luck in those races, a lot of success. And I found out that Gordon McKenzie was an engineer for the city of New York, working in the Bronx State Supreme Courthouse building where they had city offices. So I marched myself in there one day in about 1977 or early 78, introduced myself, told him what I was doing, and basically got him to coach me. So for about 6 or 8 months, for 1 year of a year, maybe 2 years, Gordon McKenzie was my coach. We would meet before they tore down the old Yankee Stadium. When I mentioned McCombs Dam Park, there was a track there. It was an old dirt rubble kind of track, 400, 440-yard track, used tremendously by the community. And I would go there at my lunch hour because my office at Legal Aid was around the corner. And Gordon would come sometimes, and I would run my work out of like 16 times 200, 220s for my repeat quarters. So yeah, Gordon became my coach, unofficially, of course. And, he never asked for
Mm,
anything but just, my doing what he said. And I
wow, how
had
lucky are you?
in 70, in 77 and 78, in 77, I had my hardest stretch ever as a road runner where there was something like, I think I ran 7 races that year, and I came in first 4 times, 2 seconds, and a third, including the first ever corporate challenge in Central Park, which I won by a substantial amount. So I was winning all these 3 or 4 mile races, and Gordon was helping me quite a lot.
That's great. That's great. Well, before we conclude, is there anything else we did not mention that you want to add to this Institute of Running History?
Say it again. That was what?
Before we conclude, is there anything else you want to add that we didn't cover that you think is important to save to
Yeah,
report on the
my notes for a
history?
second. You have a list of all these people from the first generation New York
Yes.
pioneers.
Yes.
I mean, besides some of the runners I mentioned, like Ed Bowes and Joe Burns and Vince Geppetta, um, and Norm Sander and those people, I want to, Emery Santo's on here. Emery Santo was the doctor in the Bronx who I went to once to get my first cortisone shot. I was in good shape in those days. And I was about to run a fairly major race, and I was playing Frisbee and jumped for a Frisbee and landed with my knee in a rock and smashed my knee to hell.
Oh,
Went up to Emery Santo. This might have been 1975 or 76. And I remember he put me on a table and he took a magic marker and made a big circle on my knee. And then he jabbed it with this cortisone shot that was the most excruciating shot I ever got. Great guy. But I do want to mention the people who don't get mentioned enough, who basically made all the races happen. And this is people like Joe Kleineman, Kurt Steiner, Kenny Abramson, Herb Fahey. Many of those names are on your list. Harry Murphy, of course, who started Prospect Shark Track Club in the early 70s. They were just wonderful people. Milt Pataky from St. Anthony's Boys Club. They were the officials, of course. No one was paid. They would start the races. They would time the races. Who else am I forgetting here from that kind of list? And it was just really wonderful to always acknowledge them and see them at all these fantastic meets. One funny story about Kurt Steiner, I ran a race in Staten Island once in Clove Lake Park where I won. I was way ahead, 3 mile, I guess. And as I'm finishing, Kurt Steiner yells, "And here comes the great Frank Handelman." And I think I'm really hot shit. excuse me. Then in those days, there was a couple, you know, Nolan Gale, called Ed and Marion Epstein, who were a little older, and they ran together every race, and they came in last in every race they ever ran. They just started and finished last in all the Roadrunners races. You can look them up, Ed and Marion Epstein. And in that race where he thought, I'm so hot, here comes Marion Epstein last, and Kurt Steiner comes. Here comes the great Marion Epstein. I got my ego put back on the shelf there. But those people I really got very close with, and I love them so much. You know, Harry Murphy was a wonderful, wonderful guy who started Prospect Park Track Club about 1970 or 71. And he's still very famous. He's died a long time ago, but he was highly regarded in Brooklyn. They still talk about him all the time.
Yeah, unfortunately, a lot of people on those lists are not with us anymore.
Yep. Let's see, who else? Let me look at my notes for a second before we finish. I want to make sure I mention Ed Levy, who I guess he was the assistant coach of the Pioneer Club, but he really ran the workouts more in my 3 years there than Joe Yancey. Ed was a phenomenal guy. I lived at 96th in Columbus, and Ed and his wife Valerie still lives there, lived at 95th in Columbus. So I'd see him all the time in the grocery store, and we were friends. And he was just a phenomenal guy who coached that team, I'm sure, without pay for decades. So that was really wonderful. Let me look one more time to see if anything is important I want to talk about for a second. You got a moment or two?
Absolutely. I mean, you're incredible. I love hearing all these stories.
Well, as you know, I segued into becoming a coach. When I was a legal aid lawyer in the 70s, I took a leave of absence 1 year and coached at Adelphi University and had a tremendous success with a team that won the local Division II cross country championships and went to California for the Nationals, NCAA Division II. And then in the springtime, my 2-mile relay beat Villanova in the Garden in a big meet. And one of my runners, a really great athlete named Billy Dabney, ran 146 for the 800, made the Olympic trials. So we had, that's the 1 year I did that. Then I went back to being a lawyer for whatever reason. So that was tremendous. I ended up 1 year coaching at Hunter College. And as you know, I spent 4 years as the head coach and team for kids, where I get involved and met you, 2007 to 11. So 4 years I ran that marathon training program with great coaches like yourself and Sid Howard and Wisteria and Glenn Wiener. Okay, one more thing I want to talk about. I guess you said my favorite road race was in Scarsdale in the 70s. The Metropolitan AAU 15 kilometer was in those days different than most races. Most races only had 50, 100, 100 people. Scarsdale was in April every year, a week or two before Boston. And it started and finished at Scarsdale High on a very hilly course through the streets of Scarsdale. And that's the race I wanted to win the most. I didn't. I came in third, I came in sixth, and it was usually about 800 or 900 runners. But all the track clubs and all the college teams like St. John's and Columbia, you know, the good Fordham, the good Manhattan College would show up for those meets. So I really loved that distance. That 15 kilometer was a great distance. And that was about, I wasn't much good past that distance, except that 130 kilometer I won. Most of my running was much shorter stuff. Mm-hmm. So that was my favorite thing, that race. But again, my fastest I ever ran there, I came in sixth, but my closest I ever came to the front was third. That's what it is. We went to New England with Pioneers and Central Park Track Club. We won a couple of times in the national 20 kilometers in Massachusetts or something. I know 1 year we came in second there. We had a runner named Shelley Carlin who won New York City in his early years, a student at Maryland, and joined us and became one of our great athletes. He died much too young, 49 years old. I know you have a long list of questions. We're about done. Let's see. I want to mention for sure Arthur Hall from Staten Island, who was a great rival. He beat me most of the time, but not by much. I beat him once or twice, but he was a great runner who also died quite young, and he was quite young, probably in about age 55 or 60. And he's a very famous guy out in Staten Island, and he was sort of the major domo and the guy behind the North Shore Track Club or whatever it was called. And he was very important, a wonderful friend. I mean, the thing to understand about the early days is you would get to start and know where you were going to finish because you knew everybody. So I'd be in the locker room and Tony Colon from Manhattan College would come in. I'd say, okay, maybe I'll come in second. And then Norb Sander would come in. Maybe I'll come in third. Almost always it was what you thought you'd do based on knowing who people were.
Right, because you were all so close.
Yeah, also I was very fortunate in the 70s when I would win races in New York. That was before this enormous influx of Ethiopians and Kenyans and the phenomenal Mexicans and South Americans that run for West Side Y, who probably would have kicked my ass in those days. So I always believed the races I won were because not only did I run well, but someone else didn't show up. So,
Sure. Well, yes, that is a runner's wish. Please don't show up. Let me win today.
one more point, and maybe I'm done. I mentioned these training books. I'm almost positive that the road running scene moved to New York in December of 1972 to Central Park, because in my little training book here on December 3rd, it was called the Road Runners Central Park 6-mile run, and the races in Van Cortlandt in Van Cortlandt Park or McCombs Dam, it always had 30 or 40 people. Here I came in, I wrote down here 5th place out of 99. So we had a huge run. It was very good for me in those days. I was just becoming a distance runner. I don't even know who won. I could probably find that in one of those old magazines. But I came 5th. There was 99 runners. And then my little calendar book from the next year, in the same exact race, I came in 6th out of 233.
Yeah.
So
They
the
started
race
growing.
more than doubled in 1 year. And then, of course, now every race they put on has 5,000 runners.
I know. It's incredible. But I think it's also easy access to get to Central Park.
Was it what?
Easy access to get to
Yeah,
Central
I
Park.
think,
Not like going down to McCombs Dam Park.
people would attribute Frank Shorter's run in the 1972 marathon in Munich as kick-starting
That is
NASCAR
true. He
competition.
did
But I think
running the
when I
first
wrote
running.
about this in that article about Fred that I mentioned, I think it began when things came to Central Park.
Yeah.
Because the media exposure and the amount of people running and all the clubs that then started up and developed, huge amount, like Van Cortlandt Track Club and our club, and Flushing Metal Track Club and Warren Street in New Jersey, all these teams, started to emerge and become really good teams. And I think it's because everything moved to Central Park.
Yeah. No, I agree. I agree.
All right, I think I'm pretty much done. We haven't talked about track and field at all because when I got older, I went back to my original distance of 800 meters. And I knew that I stopped, my last serious road racing ever, literally was when I was about 36 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And I ran 10,000 a couple times on road races. And the last story is that the last road race I ever ran, if I remember, was called the Bloomingdale's Perrier 10,000 in Central Park in about 81. And Bloomingdale's had one of their display window features for 6 months on this race coming up. So there were basically, the race was several thousand people, and about 2/3 of them had never run before. So it was like a bloodbath.
Yes.
Sponsored by Perrier. And I remember it very, very well. And I know I remember it very well because I finished like right in front of Gary Murphy, right behind Gary Murphy. I can't remember. We ran together. I was whatever I ran, 31 something. But that's when they brought in some professional athletes because I was only about 20th in the race or whatever I was. But there were thousands of people and tons of people had no idea what they were doing. There was no training program. That was just an explosion of insanity.
Yes. Yeah. Those races are not fun to run.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I interviewed you back in 2018 for Lifetime Running. And one of the questions was, what is your training philosophy? And you said to make running a lifetime pursuit. And I think you certainly have done that.
Well, I did to a certain extent. I mean, I got starting at age 16 up until my 60s with some success. The last time I was successful in 800 meters when I won the nationals was 2007 when I was 62 years old. And then I started having all these surgeries. But I kept trying and I kept running. And now basically I'm coaching. I'm coaching middle school kids up here in Connecticut. Um, but I go for occasional jogs. Mostly I do bike riding. I'm in the gym. I don't love gyms, but I do it. Just I'll be 80 this next spring. So we
Jeez.
all get
Well,
older.
see, but you still kept it a lifetime pursuit, even though you're coaching,
Right. I
and
try
you're
to stay in
spreading the
great
word.
shape, but to say that I'm active runner these days is sort of a misnomer, and I haven't really seriously competed in a very long time.
No, but you're teaching another generation to come up and race
Yeah,
and learn.
absolutely. I'm still
That's
deeply
great.
involved, and I love doing it.
Well, as Gary said, if you get Frank Handelman, you're going to hit gold because of
Well,
his history and everything he knows. So I want to thank you for your insights and your memories and for sharing everything. It's been wonderful, Frank.
thank you very much, Gail. It's been always great seeing you, and I'm glad when you were with me with the Team for Kids program. That was very
Yeah,
successful too,
we
which
did.
I
We
think
had a good
is
time.
still a big deal. Team for Kids,
Yeah,
still,
I think so too.
it's still around.
All right, Frank, enjoy your day.
Love talking to you, Gail. Thanks very much.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye bye.